The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood, its peaceful hum interrupted by the sharp crackle of laughter and the faint sizzle of cigarettes burning too close to the dry grass. On the edge of his perfectly manicured lawn, Paul Grady, a retired Marine with a stance that still commanded respect, stood on his porch, gripping the railing as he scanned the commotion in front of him. Four men, their clothes rumpled and their postures slack, leaned against the fence that bordered Paul's property. Smoke drifted lazily from their cigarettes, curling upward like a mocking gesture. One of them flicked an ash directly onto Paul's pristine lawn, the small, glowing ember settling in the vibrant green, like an insult carved into his pride. Paul's jaw tightened, the same way it had on the countless battlefields when a situation demanded swift and decisive action. His lawn was more than grass. It was order. It was discipline. It was a sanctuary built after years of enduring chaos. And now, it was under threat from a group of men who clearly didn't know or care who they were dealing with. The laughter grew louder, one of the men tossing an empty soda can into the grass with a careless flick of his wrist. Paul exhaled sharply, setting his glass of iced tea on the railing before stepping down from the porch. His boots crunched against the gravel driveway as he crossed toward the group, his broad shoulders and unwavering gaze radiating quiet authority. "Afternoon," Paul said, his voice steady and calm, but carrying the weight of a man who wasn't used to being ignored. The men turned, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence as they sized him up. The leader, a bearded man with a lazy grin, smirked as he took another drag from his cigarette. "Something we can do for you, old man?" Paul stopped a few feet from the group, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "You're on my property," he said evenly. "Pick up your trash and move along." The leader chuckled, looking back at his crew as though Paul's words were the punchline to a joke. "This patch of grass is your big problem? Come on, Grandpa, don't you have something better to do?" Paul's sharp eyes didn't waver. "This isn't a joke. Last chance. Get off my lawn." The bearded man stepped closer, the smirk twisting into a sneer. "And if we don't?" Paul took another step forward, his presence suddenly larger, his voice lowering to a razor's edge. "Then you'll learn exactly why I earned those stripes." Paul stood his ground, the switchblade now lying in the grass a few feet away, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The leader of the group scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The other men froze in place, their earlier bravado rapidly disintegrating as they processed what had just happened. "You really want to do this?" Paul said, his voice as calm as a sniper's breath. He shifted his stance slightly, his boots planted firmly on the grass as he adjusted his posture. He wasn't just a retired Marine anymore. He was a man defending his ground, his principles, and his home. The wiry man with the baseball cap cursed under his breath and reached into his back pocket, pulling out a length of chain. "You think you're tough, huh, old man?" he spat, swinging the chain experimentally. The metallic clink echoed through the still air, a sharp counterpoint to the tension crackling in the scene. Paul didn't reply. He simply tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the weapon, the posture, and the clear lack of skill. "Put it down before you hurt yourself," he said evenly. The man lunged. The chain whipped through the air, aimed at Paul's torso, but it was a clumsy, desperate swing, telegraphed from a mile away. Paul sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing the chain with one hand and yanking it forward. The younger man stumbled, his balance thrown off as Paul spun the chain around his wrist and pulled it taut. "Enough!" Paul barked, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. With a sharp tug, he sent the wiry man sprawling face first into the dirt. The chain clattered uselessly to the ground beside him. Another of the group, a burly man with tattoos creeping up his neck, took a hesitant step forward, his fists clenched. "You're asking for it now," he growled, but there was no mistaking the uncertainty in his tone. Paul straightened, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the lawn. "If you're smart, you'll walk away," he said. "But if you're as dumb as your friends, come on, let's get this over with." The man hesitated, glancing at the others. The leader, now standing off to the side, barked, "What are you waiting for? Get him!" The burly man roared and charged, his weight behind the swing of his fist. But Paul was faster. He ducked under the punch and drove his elbow into the man's ribs, the impact reverberating through the air. The burly man staggered back, clutching his side, before Paul delivered a quick, precise kick to his knee, sending him toppling onto the grass. "That's two," Paul said, his tone sharp and commanding. He turned his gaze to the remaining two men, who now looked far less certain about their chances. "You still want to try?" The man with the baseball cap scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip, and took a step back. "This guy's crazy," he muttered. "I'm not sticking around for this." The leader snarled, his face twisted with frustration. "You coward! Don't let him get away with this." But Paul had already shifted his attention back to the leader. "It's over," he said, his voice low and steady. "Take your guys and leave." The leader's eyes darted to the knife still lying in the grass, then back to Paul. His pride was clearly at war with his better judgment. Finally, he spat on the ground and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a venomous growl. "You think you're tough, old man? We'll be back." Paul's gaze didn't waver. "If you come back, you won't like what happens." The group began to retreat, their earlier swagger completely gone. The wiry man picked up the chain, glancing nervously at Paul before shoving it into his pocket. The burly man limped as he followed, muttering curses under his breath. The leader was the last to leave, his eyes locked on Paul's until the very end. As the sound of their retreating footsteps faded, Paul finally let out a slow breath. The adrenaline coursing through his veins began to ebb, replaced by the steady calm of someone who had just emerged victorious. He bent down and picked up the discarded knife, turning it over in his hand before tossing it into the trash bin by the porch. The faint hum of the neighborhood began to return, birds chirping, a distant lawnmower buzzing, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Paul turned back toward his house, his steps deliberate and measured. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, neighbors peeking through curtains or standing silently behind their fences, watching the aftermath of the confrontation. As he stepped onto the porch, his gaze swept across the street. A few of the braver neighbors emerged from their houses, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. One of them, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt, raised a hesitant hand in a wave. Paul nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't linger. He wasn't looking for applause or validation. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more. Inside, Paul set the switchblade and chain on the kitchen counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He poured himself a fresh glass of iced tea, the condensation cool against his hand, and took a long sip. The tension in his muscles began to ease, though his mind remained sharp, already calculating the next steps. The gang might have retreated, but their leader's parting words still hung in the air like a storm cloud. Paul knew men like that didn't take defeat lightly. They'd be back, and next time, they'd come with more than just cheap weapons and overconfidence. But that was a fight Paul was ready for. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the quiet. He picked it up, glancing at the screen to see a text from his neighbor across the street. "Are you okay? We saw what happened. Let us know if you need anything." Paul typed a quick reply. "All good, thanks." He set the phone down and walked to the living room, sinking into his favorite armchair. The weight of the day began to settle over him, but he didn't feel tired. If anything, he felt sharper, more alive. He had spent years in combat zones, defending people who couldn't defend themselves. This was no different. His home, his community, it was worth fighting for. And if those trespassers thought they could intimidate him, they had made a grave mistake. Paul glanced at the photos on the mantle above the fireplace, images of his time in the Marines, of his family, of the life he had built after his service. Each one was a reminder of the values he held dear: discipline, honor, and an unyielding commitment to doing what was right. He leaned back in the chair, the cool glass of iced tea in his hand, and let his mind settle. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. For now, the neighborhood was quiet again, and Paul intended to enjoy the peace while it lasted. Because if those men came back, they'd find out exactly what kind of fight they had started. The tension hung in the air even after the group of trespassers retreated, their curses and idle threats echoing faintly as they disappeared down the street. Paul remained on his porch, his posture as steady as a mountain, his sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood for any sign of their return. The discarded knife and chain lay in the trash bin by the steps, silent reminders of the standoff that had just unfolded. A few neighbors cautiously emerged from their homes, their movements hesitant and their gazes flicking between Paul and the now empty street. One older woman, who lived in the brick house across the road, waved tentatively. Paul raised a hand in acknowledgement, but didn't move from his spot. He stood there for a while longer, allowing the adrenaline to ebb and his senses to settle. Years of experience had taught him not to relax too quickly after a confrontation. Loose ends had a way of snapping back at the worst times. But for now, the street was quiet, and the faint hum of suburban life began to return. Inside, Paul set the iced tea glass back on the counter and leaned against the sink, his weathered hands gripping the edge. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, highlighting the photos on the fridge, snapshots of his family, his time in the Marines, and the life he had built after service. Each image was a reminder of what he was protecting, of why he hadn't backed down. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Paul allowed himself to sit down at the kitchen table. The sharp ache in his shoulder reminded him of the punch he'd blocked earlier, a dull throb that brought a faint smile to his face. Pain was nothing new to him, and this particular ache carried a sense of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, and that mattered. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the room in warm, golden hues. Paul sipped his tea, his thoughts drifting. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, not with regret, but with a tactical analysis honed over decades. He had handled it well, but the gang leader's final words lingered. "This isn't over." Paul knew they'd be back. Men like that didn't take kindly to being shown up, especially by someone they underestimated. But Paul wasn't worried. If anything, he welcomed the opportunity to remind them, and anyone else who thought they could walk over him, that respect was non-negotiable. As dusk fell, Paul began preparing. He checked the locks on his doors, double-checked the floodlights around the perimeter of his house, and made a few quiet phone calls. By the time the neighborhood settled into its usual nighttime rhythm, Paul was ready for whatever might come next. He didn't want trouble, but he wasn't afraid of it either. The next few days passed quietly. The gang didn't return, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Neighbors stopped by to check on Paul, their words a mix of gratitude and concern. "You really stood up to them," one man said, shaking his head. "I don't know how you did it." Paul shrugged. "Just doing what needed to be done." But even as the days turned into weeks, Paul remained vigilant. He kept his routine, mowing the lawn, fixing things around the house, and enjoying the simple pleasures of retirement. But there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He was always listening, always watching, his senses tuned to the faintest hint of trouble. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch reading the paper, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Paul tensed for a moment, but his expression remained calm as two men stepped out, their suits crisp and their movements deliberate. "Mr. Grady?" one of them asked, approaching with a briefcase in hand. Paul set the paper aside and rose slowly, his sharp eyes assessing the newcomers. "Who's asking?" The man extended a hand, his demeanor professional. "Agent Carter, Homeland Security. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Paul's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't reply immediately. Instead, he motioned for them to sit on the porch, his own movements unhurried as he settled back into his chair. The agents explained their presence. The gang he had confronted wasn't just a group of petty criminals. They were part of a larger network involved in illegal activities across the state. Paul's actions had disrupted their operations, and the agency was now investigating their movements. "You may have done more than just protect your lawn," Agent Carter said, his tone carrying a note of respect. Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Just doing what anyone else would have done?" "Not everyone would have stood their ground like you did," the agent replied. "We'll be keeping an eye on things around here, but if you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to reach out." After they left, Paul sat quietly for a while, the weight of their words sinking in. He had never sought attention or recognition for his actions, but knowing he had made an impact, however small, brought a sense of quiet pride. As the weeks turned into months, the gang didn't return. The neighborhood returned to its peaceful rhythm, and Paul's reputation as a man who didn't back down became something of a legend among his neighbors. Parents pointed to his house when teaching their kids about standing up for what's right, and even the local sheriff stopped by occasionally just to check in. Paul never let it go to his head. To him, the confrontation was just another chapter in a life defined by discipline and resilience. He had fought for his country, his family, and now his home. And if the time came to fight again, he would be ready. As the sun set one evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Paul sat on his porch, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. His lawn was as immaculate as ever, a symbol of order in an unpredictable world. And as he sipped his tea, his gaze steady on the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, he'd face it head on, just as he always had.